We are fortunate to have Paul Munter, former SEC Chief Accountant, with us today to discuss the future of SOX 404. Paul, I want to discuss two recent legislative proposals. First, folding the PCAOB into the SEC, initially part of the big beautiful bill passed by the House and subsequently removed for technical reasons, it now sits on the sidelines. Some, including PCAOB board member Christina Ho, argue this provision would have provided the SEC with a more holistic view of issuer matters. Others, like myself, are concerned with the potential implications to the PCAOB's funding and its ability to operate in the multitude of geographies, industries, and subject matters that it does today. Paul, what's your take on this one?
Yeah, I think similar. I can think a couple of things. I think one is, I'll call it the strategic aspects, some which Christina is talking about, and I guess I have a different view on that, where you've got the PCAOB, which is an organization whose sole focus is on trying to drive improvements in audit quality for the benefit of investors. That is its job. And if you were to fold it into the SEC, that becomes one of, I don't know what the number of priorities are, but it's a lot more priorities. And then where does audit quality fit on the priority list within the SEC? Second, as you touched on, is the resource question. The PCAOB, as you know, is subject to funding where issuers and registered broker-dealers, for the most part, pay for the funding of the PCAOB, with the budget subject to the approval of the SEC, but then it is not subject to congressional appropriation process, whereas the SEC is subject to congressional appropriation. Just to give you a frame of reference, the SEC has been under flat funding for 3 consecutive fiscal years at the federal government. The SEC's request for next year is for flat funding again. But the other thing pragmatically is the agreements that the PCAOB has to do inspections internationally are agreements between the PCAOB and the relevant authority in that country. They are not agreements between the federal government or the SEC and that authority. So you'd have to go back and renegotiate all of that, which means you run the risk of being unable to inspect internationally for some period of time, which I think would be particularly problematic given the long history of inability to inspect in China. So I think that would be a big risk.
Paul, let's shift to the second proposal, which is currently active in the House. This proposal seeks to exempt a greater number of smaller, newer public companies from external audit attestation on internal controls. Some argue that SOX compliance takes significant funding away from research and development. Let's hear from the CEO of Arcutis Biotherapeutics, which went public in 2020.
Since inception, we've invested about $1.4 billion in developing our products and have grown from 3 employees to 350, with operations in all 50 states and employees in 39. But we have yet to turn a profit, let alone recoup our massive investments in R&D. I'd like to share some of the challenges that Arcutis faces due to Section 404B of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. While I fully support regulation, it needs to be smart regulation that accounts for a company's size and the cost of compliance. I believe it is unreasonable and wasteful to impose the same compliance requirements on a 350-person biotech with revenues below $200 million as those for an 80,000-person company with $60 billion in revenues, as the law currently requires.
Honestly, I'm not sure this is their strongest case. Despite spending $11 million to date on SOX compliance, Arcutis has managed to fund $1.4 billion in product development and currently has a $1.6 billion market cap. Now, one other argument being made on this topic is that companies are effectively paying for 2 audits of internal controls, one required for management attestation and another by the external auditor. Supporters of this proposal argue that management-only attestation suffices, but I'd argue management-only attestation is far less rigorous than an external audit. Paul, love to hear your take on raising the exemption threshold for auditor attestation.
So I think one of the things that needs to be thought about from the benefit side is greater investment in effective internal control and potentially attestation of that has the potential to reduce fraud in the company, which obviously is beneficial to the company and to its shareholders. But I do agree that we need to think about appropriate scaling and what does it mean for cost benefit trade-offs? And I do think that regulation does need to be calibrated at an appropriate cost benefit level. But I do not think that focusing on the fee that is paid to auditors for attestation ought to be the sole driver of that analysis, just because that is a more precise metric in the total cost benefit analysis. I think it is just part of the analysis, and it needs to be thought through very carefully. But I do think your point you're making is a really good one, which is if you take away auditor attestation, that places a lot greater responsibility on management, and in particular the audit committee from a governance perspective, to try to make sure that there is appropriate rigor in the management assurance process. And like you, my experience has been that without attestation, that level of rigor tends to drop off noticeably.